finalist, and the block cipher prince. So let's give them full attention.
Hi all, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for your interest. Glad that we have now more seats available in this room here. And what I'm going to talk about is a rather high level, 20-25 minutes about how to use cryptanalysis to speed up password cracking. This is joint work with Jens Christian Hillerup. Very brief motivation, as I presume you are well aware of the situation. Whenever you want to handle passwords, storing them directly is a very bad idea. It's an unnecessary risk. And what people do is to use some kind of one-way transformation and apply them to their passwords and then, for example, store them. And in absence of any dedicated functions or transformations since the early 90s, cryptographic hash functions like MD5 or SHA-1 became a very popular choice to do this. In the meanwhile, we know a little bit more about this problem, and we strongly disrecommend to use these kind of functions. But nevertheless, because they were so popular, it's very hard to get rid of them, and they will be around for a very long time. So this question will be, the following question will be relevant for a long time, namely, how fast can we call these hash functions and use them to guess passwords as fast as possible? So this is the motivation for this work. Previously, there was a continuous development with faster and faster password guessing methods, and they were driven by very clever implementers. Just look at the last years or 2 years instantiation of this password conference. There were very nice explanations of this kind of implementation level techniques to make password guessing faster. What is new here in this project is to use knowledge from the analysis of this hash function, from this academic analysis to help, basically. This was already conceived in 2012, and we did this together with my student Jens Christian in 2013, and immediately this found some use in the very popular password cracking software Hashcat. So what I'm going to do now is basically to give you an overview of the background of these techniques, then very briefly show you the results at the end. And then also I have a number of open issues at the end. That's the reason why I'm here, actually. I would like to meet some of you. So, but let's take a step back first. So these hash functions that are used so often to apply them on passwords, they are usually designed with the following requirements. First of all, they should be efficient to compute. That's very important for normal applications of cryptographic hashing. For the password hashing situation, actually, this is not really a feature. It may be a bug. It is a bug, actually. But nevertheless, that's what these functions have as a property. Then they have certain security requirements. It should be very hard to find collisions, and it should be very hard to find pre-images or second pre-images. Let me very briefly go into these. So what is a pre-image attack? So the situation here is that we are given the output of a hash function. This can be a string of bits of length, for example, 128, 256 bits. And we would like to find an input that would map to this output. And now, without knowing anything else about the structure of the input, and having n bits of output, it would take us 2 to the n guesses on average to find an input that would map to such an output. And if n is large enough, then such an attack is in general infeasible. Second pre-image attack is something quite similar. The difference is that we are given here an input already that hashes to a particular output, 2, 3, A, and so on, as seen on this slide. And now the challenge is to find another input that would also hash to this output. The generic attack, without knowing anything else, is the same. For n bits output size, we need 2 to the n guesses on average. So there's another attack called collision attack, which is simpler generically. Here, the only goal is to find 2 inputs that map to the same output. And there we can use of the birthday paradox to have a generic attack that runs in complexity 2 to the n over 2. So for a hash function of output size 128 bits, for example, without using any other property, an attack would need 2 to the 64 operations, which is borderline practically these days. So now, having discussed these generic attacks, let me now briefly review this family of hash functions where MD5 and SHA-1 belong to these very popular hash functions, just to give you an idea of how they work. I have a few slides on this. So what you see here is one compression function. If you hash a string of arbitrary length, you have to call this compression function that you see here on the slide many times. For hash function use cases, usually you call this compression function once, and then maybe feed the output into another call again. So that's why it suffices to look at this particular construction here. So what you see is that the message comes in here. In these cases of designs, it has 16 words. Then it's expanded by this message expansion to 48, 64, or 80 words, depending on the actual design. And then each of these words is fed into a step of the state update transformation, which again starts with a fixed constant, what we call initial value, and then subsequent steps update this internal state, this initial value, based on the message. And then after enough steps are computed, the output is generated. And then depending on, again, the actual design, we have 4, 5, or 8 words, resulting word size being 32 or 64 bits, because these hash functions are designed to be very fast in general purpose CPUs of the 90s. And afterwards, we have output sizes of 128 up to 512 bits. Let's briefly look at those two components, the message expansion first. So we have the 16 input words and map them to 48 up to 80 output words. Now the earlier designs, MD4, MD5, and RightMD, what they do is they simply rearrange the input words. The first 16 words, they go directly to the output, and the next 16 are a rearrangement, a permutation of the first, and then go to the output. So this is fairly simple. In the case of SHA and SHA-1, the NSA designs that were based on the MD4, MD5 designs, they use something slightly more complicated, a linear recurrence relation. So a simple linear computation based on these 16 input words results in the full 64 or 80 output words. Then, as another step, 5 to 10 years later, the SHA-2 members were publicly announced, again making a step towards more complicated design. Here, this mapping from the input to the output of this message expansion is no longer linear but nonlinear. So it's mixing various operations in mathematical groups, and then this is supposed to make it more secure. But of course, also harder to analyze. But what we can see here in this timeline, starting from the early 90s up to 15 years later, is this increase in complexity. Supposedly more secure, but also harder to analyze. And if you look at the state update transformation, the second important part of the compression function, we see a very similar development. Again, the designers of MD4 is comparatively simple when you look at the SHA-2 members, for example. We will not need the details here, so this is just to give you a high-level idea of how they look like. What you see here is one step out of 64 or 80 or 48 steps that are used in such a compression function. The structure that is used here we call unbalanced Feistel network. There's simple arithmetic operations that are used, Boolean functions, integer addition, XORs, and so on, bitwise rotations. Yeah. So what's the situation about these hash functions? So they all, as we saw, belong to a very similar design family. They all look fairly similar. So what happened already soon after the first one was designed in MD4, and then like 10, 15 years later, around 2004, 2005, what happened was that, well, big news, many of them got broken. Broken in a sense, it was suddenly possible to find a practical collision attack. This means it was suddenly feasible with a chip computer to find two inputs that map to the same output. So that was a big disaster for many applications of these hash functions. In the case of SHA-1, it's similar, except that the cost of finding such a collision is still very high. However, collision attacks are actually not relevant for password guessing. What is relevant is pre-image attacks, or what I call them here, inversion attacks. And here, people tried to find attacks as well, especially motivated by these collision attacks that have been discovered. But there, the attacks are far away from practical. So as we heard before, without knowing anything, the generic attack for MD4, MD5, which has 128 bits outputs, would cost 2 to the 128. So now these shortcut attacks that people found are for MD4, for example, at the order of 2 to the 96, for MD5 at the order of 2 to the 123. So somewhat faster than brute force, but still very far from a practical threat. In the case of SHA-1 and SHA-2 and so on, there's no faster than brute force attack known. So when we as cryptanalysts cannot break the full scheme, what we do is we reduce the number of rounds, so we reduce the number of steps in the scheme. And if we do this enough, then at some point we will find an attack. And for the case of SHA-1, this is possible. So based on this, of course, it's understandable to simply dismiss all this work in the password setting, because these attacks, these pre-image attacks, are clearly not practical. Even more, the password cracking problem is actually harder than this generic pre-image attacks that I've shown in the last slide, because the inputs are not completely free to choose for the attacker. So there's a lot of restrictions on a potential attack. So that's why at first sight it seems fairly difficult to use any of this. So giving up is the question mark here. Well, if I would answer yes here, then it would be little point to come here. So what I'm going to do is to review these attacks, even though they are completely impractical at first, and then show how they still can be applied to speed up password guessing. And this class of attack that became very popular and in some ways successful is called meet-in-the-middle attacks. The basic meet-in-the-middle attack works as follows. So we again look at this picture here as an illustration of this compression function that we just saw. We have the message input here at the bottom, and we start with an IV, and we end with the output computation. So what we can do now, depending on how this works in detail, is that we can guess two parts of this message independently, depending on the structure. Let's assume we can do this. So we guess this forward and the backwards part independently, and then we compute forwards from P, and we compute backwards from the output C. And what we can then do is to meet in the middle. So somewhere in the middle we have this internal state, and we just compare. We keep a list of the forward combinations, for example, and while doing the backward computation we simply look for a match. And then the complexity is reduced. It's basically related to the size of these guesses that we do, either at the forward part or at the backward part. In the most ideal case, the complexity can be the square root of the generic attack. So if we have an internal state of n bits, this can work with complexity as low as 2 to the n over 2. But in any real hash function that is used for password hashing, things are not so simple. But you can extend this approach by not requiring to meet at the full internal state, but only at a part of the internal state. This is illustrated here. So it may no longer be necessary to completely separate the forward and the backwards part. You can have some part that is not separated, and you can still do these computations. You get a small error rate because of false positives for this matching, but this is actually negligible in many cases. Still, this little trick may not be good enough to apply it to your full setting. What you can do is to again reduce the requirement of these guesses to smaller parts of these message spaces, and then first guess that part that is not separable, called A0 here, and then after you do that, in an inner loop, do then this meet-in-the-middle attack that I showed you before with this independent guessing of the forward and the backward part. The gain here is no longer as big, but it can still be significant depending on how the details here look like. So these are all attack vectors that are standard tools in cryptanalysis. Still, sometimes this does not work very well. Because, for example, the construction has too many rounds, and for example, MD5 has 64 rounds, so that's quite a lot. So it's quite hard to find such a separation of inputs that allow you to apply this kind of cryptanalytic attack. So what can happen is that indeed you might find something that looks like a mid-in-the-middle attack, but then things don't meet in the middle because they are too far apart. For example, there's many rounds in between. And what you can do is to still use the high-level idea of these attacks, but then do a brute force phase in the middle. So you no longer gain in the high-level loop if you count the number of iterations, because you still have to go through all possibilities, but now you have to only go through all possibilities in this inner part and no longer at the outer part. Advanced version of this attack vector were, for example, used as a big leak attack on a yes in 2011. And this is now exactly the starting point of applying these techniques to password cracking. Because what you can do is take MD5 or SHA-1 or whatever, separate the inputs in this way, which means you don't have to compute in the most inner loop parts of the forward and parts of the backward part, and only have to compute the inner part. And the smaller this inner part becomes, the more efficient your password guessing becomes. And to cut a long story short, in this project that we did, we looked at MD5 because it's one of the most widely used examples. And applying all these tricks, out of the 64 steps of MD5, we could save 21 with some version of these techniques. And we restricted ourselves to not too long passwords, such that we could loop through a large enough fraction of those to have a meaningful benchmarks, and also short passwords are maybe unfortunately still the standard case. If we had longer passwords, these attacks get a little bit more freedom, and this means even more steps can be saved. The thing I would like to point out here is these are kind of generic algorithmic improvements, so they can in principle be used on top of all those clever optimizations that people have developed before, be it on standard high-level CPUs or on GPUs or on many other settings. Yeah. So what we did not do yet, for example, this is now going towards the conclusion of my talk, is to now connect to you and ask you for a few things or propose a few things. So, for example, the speed of password cracking not only depends on efficient implementation or some kind of shortcut attacks, as mentioned here, but also of guessing likely passwords first in some kind of clever way. So these heuristics can, of course, be should, of course, be combined in order to get even more speed. The thing is, this again restricts the way this attack can be applied. The gains will be a little bit lower, but our hypothesis is that there will still be gains. There's still a lot to do when it comes to optimized implementations, and this is only one tool in the toolbox of cryptanalysis that we applied. There's actually quite a few more tricks that are not applied yet, and that will allow to apply this method not only this will allow to save even more steps in this computation and apply this method also to other hash functions that are used for password cracking. So let me wrap up. So what this project kind of illustrates is a merger of two communities in a way that so far worked relatively independently. On the one hand, cryptanalysis, the science of breaking codes, including hash functions in this case, so far we're not really concerned with speed up of brute force attacks, which are the type of attack that you do when you do password guessing. But it turns out that this cryptanalysis know-how can be used. And yeah, on the other hand, the password cracking community very good at finding very fast implementations and tricks there. Didn't really have access to much of this sometimes hard to it's academic cryptanalysis work. And the result here, the combination of the two is that we get new speed records for this kind of program. So with this I conclude. Thanks a lot for your attention. And any questions? Yes, please. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. I think so the question is, can we use these techniques that I just explained also for SHA-3? Which is, let me explain you a little bit. So what I showed you before, this tree of hash functions that all have similar design principle, and the fact that so many attacks appeared, this led to, in the middle, well, like 10 years ago, 8 years ago, it led to quite a lot of concerns, and that's why people started a competition to design a new hash function, which is called, was just recently standardized, or is in the process of being standardized, which is called SHA-3. And the main feature of this SHA-3 is that it looks very different to any of these. And now the very good question is, do these speedups apply to SHA-3 as well? And the answer is, it's not so likely, because SHA-3 has a very large internal state, and this particular attack vector, these mid-in-the-middle attacks, they have to meet in the middle somehow. It would be a nice project to look into it. I don't expect that the gains will be very large because of this property, but it would be fun to try actually. Apparently, yes. Well, I would like to find out more about this, and I think some of the Hashcat developers are here. Apparently, yes, but I don't know any details. Yeah. So I think my student was in contact with one of them, and there was some communication. And apparently, well, the source code is not public, so it's hard to know. But I think yes. I think I'm actually excited about that. So, but it could be that there's more to be gained. Yeah, so we are very good at the theoretical part, of course, and especially the Hashcat and other developers, of course, they have a lot of experience in actually implementing this in a very efficient way. And I think we should talk. There might be more to be gained. Okay. If there's no more questions, thanks again for your attention.